right. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for our presentation on the E-2 visa requirements and renewal considerations. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I am an associate with Scott Legal PC here in New York City. It is a pleasure to be talking with you all. The E-2 visa is probably the most common visa that our firm handles for our clients. And there's good reason for that. If you are from an E-2 treaty country and you want to come to the US to develop and direct a business, it really is one of the best options that is available. So we'll talk a little bit about the requirements for the visa as well as some common challenges. We at our firm are very proud to help clients who don't have an especially large amount of money to invest in the business. When we talk about risky cases, that's what we're referring to. And we are very proud to have really a great track record of helping those clients who have relatively risky cases, low investment or smaller businesses, still secure an E-2 visa and come to the US to create a good business that does employ US workers. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. I will be monitoring any questions that come in. If you do have a question during the presentation, go ahead and send it in using either the chat function or the Q&A function on Zoom. I will be monitoring those questions. I plan to get through all the questions by the end of the presentation. I may save some for the end, but don't hesitate to send those in. I do plan to answer all of them by the end. This webinar is part of a series. We try to do at least 2 webinars a month, and at this rate, I think we're probably doing 2 a week. We cover the full spectrum of US immigration law. So even though our firm does focus on business immigration, we handle the full spectrum of US immigration, whether that's family-based immigration, temporary visas, family-based green cards, humanitarian cases. If it relates to US immigration, our firm does handle it. So don't hesitate to reach out if we can be of any help at all. So after this presentation, you will be receiving an email where you can sign up for our future webinars. We do hope to see you on those. And that email will also have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation that you see on your screen. And it will also have a comprehensive guide to the E-2 visa, as well as links to our blog and our YouTube channel. We're very proud to put high quality information out to the public for free, whether that's through these webinars, through our blog, or through our YouTube channel. So do check those out. Our YouTube channel has not only short videos, again, on a variety of immigration topics, but also the full-length webinars. So this webinar will be posted to our YouTube channel. It is being recorded. I should mention that as well. So do check out our our YouTube channel for some really great videos on US immigration law. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in by talking about the E-2 visa's rules and regulations. So what is the E-2 visa? The E-2 visa, in this presentation, we are talking about the E-2 investor visa, and that is for the business owner to come to the US to develop and direct a business. There is also an E-2 employee visa for employees who have the nationality of the E-2 company. We'll talk a little bit more about what that nationality is, what that nationality requirement is. But this presentation is not going to talk about the E-2 employee visa. It's going to talk about the E-2 investor visa. So the E-2 investor visa is a non-immigrant visa. It's not a green card, but it does allow nationals of certain treaty countries to come to the US to develop and direct the operations of a business in which they have invested and which they own at least 50% of. There are a few very common pathways to getting an E-2 visa. One is to purchase a business that already exists in the US. So that could be, say, a convenience store. If someone in the US is selling a convenience store and you want to buy that convenience store, you could buy 50% of it or more and apply for the E-2 visa that way. You could also start your own business. So a lot of people, and the majority of our clients, start their own businesses. So as an example, someone may be a student in the US on an F1 visa and might be getting their accounting degree. And once they graduate, they want to start their own accounting firm. So they would show that they've invested into the business and they have done everything for the business to become operational and apply for the E-2 visa that way through a startup. The third way that people will typically apply for an E-2 visa is through a franchise. So if you do want to start a franchise in the US, that can be a very viable and good way to get an E-2 visa. So the E-2 visa is called a treaty visa, E-2 treaty investor visa. It's called a treaty visa because you need to have the nationality of what's called a treaty country. So the US has entered into treaties with, at this point, I believe there are more than 80 countries around the world that have E-2 treaties with the United States. If you have the passport from one of these 80 plus countries, then you can apply for the E-2 visa based on satisfying the nationality requirement. Now, of course, you do need to satisfy the other parts that we'll talk about in this presentation, such as investing and owning the business. But a threshold requirement is you need to have a passport from one of the E-2 treaty countries. You don't need to have been born in an E-2 treaty country. You don't even need to have lived in the E-2 treaty country. Just as an example, let's say you are from Uruguay. You were born in Uruguay, you've lived in Uruguay your whole life, but through a parent, you have an Italian passport. Uruguay is not an E-2 treaty country, so you would not be able to apply for an E-2 visa based on your Uruguayan passport. But if you have that Italian passport, because Italy is an E-2 treaty country, you could apply through your Italian passport, even if you've never even been to Italy. So the requirement is you need to have a passport from an E-2 treaty country. And the final bullet on the screen asks, how long is the E-2 visa valid for? The answer depends on where your passport is from. So the United States will negotiate the validity period with the treaty country. So there's something called reciprocity. And if you Google Department of State reciprocity, you will be able to click on the name of the country where you have the passport from and find out how long the E-2 visa is issued for based on where your passport's from. But the validity period ranges from a minimum of 3 months in countries such as Bangladesh to 5 years for countries such as Canada, for example. Many countries have the 5-year maximum. Very few have a 3-month period of validity, fortunately. So it does range from 3 months to 5 years. A quick note on that is, regardless of how long your visa is valid for, each time you enter the United States on the E-2 visa, you're given 2 years of status in the US. So you're allowed to stay in the US for 2 years. Just to take an extreme example, let's say you have an E-2 visa from Bangladesh. It's valid for 3 months. Let's say your travel plans get delayed and it is the last day of that 3-month period that your visa is valid for. You enter the US on that last day, you should still be given 2 years of E-2 status in the United States. Now, once you leave the US and you try to come back in, if that visa is expired, you're not going to be allowed in typically. So you'd have to renew the visa. The visa is really the document that lets you ask to be allowed into the United States. It has nothing to do with how long you're allowed to stay in the US once you enter, and that's an important distinction. So the E-2 visa requirements, I've touched on a few of these. So let's run down this list. You must be a national of a treaty country. That means having a passport from a treaty country, not being born there necessarily. You must make an investment. We'll talk more about how much of an investment is enough. But in general, what the government wants to see is that you have put your own money on the line for this business. And that does two things. First of all, it shows the government that you're serious about this. You are not applying for an E-2 visa to simply come into the US and spend time with family and friends or to travel around. You are coming into the US to commit yourself to developing a business with the goal of employing US workers, which we'll get to in a minute. So The funds do need to actually have been spent. You need to invest money into the business, and investing those funds means the money has to be spent. It is not enough to just transfer funds into the business bank account. It's easy to transfer funds out of the business bank account. So the government does want to see that you spent those funds on things such as renting an office space, buying equipment for the business, buying inventory, paying employees, marketing the business, creating a website, all the things that a business needs to become operational. When you are purchasing a business, the investment is typically the fair market value of the business you're buying. So if the business you're buying, let's go back to the example I used before of a convenience store. If that convenience store is being marketed to the public, and you pay the fair market value, what it's being advertised for, typically that is enough. But in the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about how much investment is enough. This third requirement you see on your screen, the business cannot be marginal, is really key. The word marginal is used in an odd way in the E-2 visa context. We usually don't use the word marginal in this way, but when the government says the business needs to be more than marginal, what it means is the business needs to employ U.S. workers. So the business should not only support the investor and their family. You do need to show that over the course of 5 years, the business will employ at least 3 full-time equivalent U.S. workers. And why is this requirement really key? What I often say is that this is a make or break requirement. This is what I mean by that. If you do not convince the government that your business will employ U.S. workers, then it is very likely to be denied. On the other hand, if your application is weak in other areas, so for example, let's say you haven't invested a lot of money into the business. You've invested enough for it to be operational, but it doesn't cost a lot to get started. So the investment amount is low. You can overcome that weakness by showing that you already have U.S. workers. So that requirement to employ U.S. workers is something that really can boost a weak application or can result in a denial if you fail to satisfy that one requirement and convince and fail to convince the consular officer that you're going to employ U.S. workers. The fourth requirement you see is that the business must be real and operating. And I think the easiest way to think about this is when you are at the consulate discussing interviewing for your visa, they may ask you, what else needs to happen? If I give you the visa right now, does anything else need to happen before this business is operating? And you need to be able to answer no to that question. There is nothing else that needs to happen before this business is operational. You want to be able to say to the officer, as soon as you give me this visa, I'm getting a flight to the US and I'm going to start selling and I'm going to start hiring US workers. If there's anything else that needs to happen, such as the business needs a license, let's say that you're opening a restaurant and you haven't gotten your permit from the state health department, that's the kind of thing that would be a problem. Or let's say you haven't gotten an office space. You're going to be selling things, or you're going to need an office for yourself and 1 or 2 other employees, but you haven't gotten the office. Those are the kinds of things that if they come up in your interview, the officer may say, you know what, this business is not operational. It's not ready to become operational, and it could result in a denial. Now, importantly, the business doesn't have to be operational before you apply. It's just that once you get the visa, you need to show you've done everything you need to do to get the business running once you arrive in the US. And similarly, I see the question came in, the number of US employees over 5 years. We recommend at least 3 full-time equivalent US workers over the course of 5 years. You also don't need to hire workers before you apply. Okay, so you can apply, we'll talk about this more, based on a business plan that shows how many people you'll employ. And again, it does need to show you'll employ at least 3 full-time equivalent workers over the course of the first 5 years of operations. The fifth requirement you see on your screen is you will solely develop and direct the E-2 enterprise. The E-2 visa is explicitly and solely for the purpose of the E-2 investor coming to the US to develop and direct a business. So you don't get work authorization through an E-2 to work for another business. It is only to work at the E-2 company. So that is very important. And you do need to show in the application that you're qualified to run the business. Now, the bar there is honestly very low. We regularly help people who are fresh out of college, who are starting businesses. So you don't need to be working in your field for a long time, but you do need to make a case for yourself to explain why you're committed to this business and why you are qualified to run it. So don't overlook that in the application. And we regularly work with our clients to craft the application to show that. The sixth requirement is a threshold requirement. If you don't satisfy it, you will be denied, which is you must own at least 50% of the E-2 company. So that applies both before you apply for the visa as well as once you have the visa. If at any point your ownership share drops below 50%, you lose your E-2 eligibility. So it is absolutely critical that if you're on an E-2 visa, you always maintain at least 50% ownership in the business. Now, what that does mean is you can have two E-2 investors. So let's say you are Canadian and you have a friend who is Italian, and you both want to invest in our convenience store that I've been using as an example. You can both invest in the business. You can both apply for the E-2 visa, assuming you each own 50%, and you can both get an E-2 visa. One interesting aspect of that is the quote unquote nationality of the business depends on the nationality of the owners. So in that example, where there's a Canadian owner and an Italian owner, that business could have E-2 employees from either Canada or Italy. So qualified employees who are nationals of Italy or qualified employees who are nationals of Canada could apply for E-2 employee visas and could come to the US to work for that company. If there's only one E-2 investor, so let's say the Canadian investor owns 51% of the business or 100% of the business, that business would only have Canadian nationality and could only support E-2 employees from Canada. Now, when I talk about E-2 employees, of course, the business can employ US workers. When I refer to E-2 employees, that's just people who are abroad who can get a visa specifically to work for the company. But the company can and should and is required to employ US workers, whether or not it has E-2 employees who are on an E-2 employee visa. Finally, point 7, you must have the intent to return home upon the expiration of the visa. So as I said before, the E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa. It is not a green card. That means that you cannot have the intention of applying for a green card when you enter the US on an E-2 visa or when you're applying for an E-2 visa. So you do need to intend to return home at the end of your visa. Now, that being said, as long as you remain eligible and the business remains eligible, you can renew your E-2 visa indefinitely. So just as an example, our firm was founded by Ian Scott, who is currently on an E-2 visa. The business was founded when he was on an E-2 visa over 10 years ago, and he has renewed his E-2 visa regularly through as a Canadian. So that is just one of many, many examples where if you remain eligible, if the business remains eligible, there really is no maximum period of time that you can renew the E-2 visa. You really can renew it indefinitely, but that does not make it a green card. It is not a green card. You always have to have the intention of leaving at the end of the at the end of your status and not to pursue a green card. So let's quickly talk about how much investment is enough. This is probably the most common question that we get from people who are interested in the E-2 visa. To answer the question very directly, there is no minimum dollar amount. The government does not say anywhere you have to invest X number of dollars to get an E-2 visa. It is not like an EB-5. So an EB-5 is a green card where there's a very clear dollar amount that you need to invest. The minimum for an EB-5 is $800,000. Fortunately, that is not the minimum for an E-2. The E-2 doesn't have a minimum, which I say fortunately because that means the investment can be quite low, honestly. So we do have examples where people are able to apply for and get E-2 visas with an investment amount well below $100,000. Now, that very much depends on the circumstances. It is a case-by-case scenario. Like I said before, you do need to be able to point to other areas of the application that are strong. So if you can't invest a large amount, hire employees, show that the business is already operational so that the investment amount is less relevant. You can show you are committed, and you can show you will employ workers in spite of a low investment amount because you already are doing that. So you do need to take those steps to strengthen the application if you have a low investment amount. And we actually have a completely separate webinar on exactly that topic, low investment and risky E-2 cases. So do check that out if you're curious. It's on our YouTube channel. But in general, the amount that the government wants to see you investing is what it calls a substantial amount. And what that means is the government wants to see that you've invested enough for the business to be operational. So how do you do that? Our applications that we prepare, one of the things we include in the application is what we call an investment schedule. So that is an Excel spreadsheet that lists out line item by line item everything that has been purchased for the business, everything that the applicant has spent money on for the business. And it's arranged by categories. So inventory, we bought, 50 boxes of cereal that we're going to sell in our convenience store for this amount of money. We bought, whatever it is, all the inventory itemized. Employee payments, here are all the payments we paid to employees. Payment for the office lease, listing out for this month, we paid this month, this much, this month we paid this much, so that the officer can see by looking at that spreadsheet, all of the categories. Okay, they've spent money on employees, they've spent money on an office space, inventory, professional fees, accountants. The officer can see at a glance that all of the categories money has been spent on the business. And if they want to get into each line item, they can look at that. And then you'll include in the application proof that you've actually, bought the items that are listed in that spreadsheet. So that would include invoices, receipts, as well as bank statements showing that the money has actually left the business's bank account to pay for those items. So as you can tell, the investment amount depends on the type of business. Certain businesses are more expensive than others to get started. If you're wanting to start a business that does manufacturing, you may need to buy heavy equipment. You may need to rent a relatively large space or warehouse versus a law firm like ours, which all you really need is a computer and a small office that you're renting. So the government it generally does exercise some discretion there, where if your business doesn't require a lot, typically they are somewhat understanding about that. Now, that being said, getting the business operational is just one part of what the investment requirement does. As I said before, the other aspect of the investment requirement is it shows the government you're serious about pursuing this visa and creating a business. So even if you're starting a law firm, let's say you've spent $20,000 and it's all your business really needs. You have your computer, you have your office space, there's not much else to buy for your law firm. You should still look for ways to boost the investment because 20,000 is low. So what we typically recommend is think about marketing, think about hiring someone who can work on advertising or can serve as an office manager or something like that. That does benefit the business while still increasing the investment amount. And again, we talk more about that in our separate webinar on low investment and risky cases. So if you're buying a business, what I said before is the fair market value of the business is typically sufficient. if the business has been operational, you'll have the past tax returns, and the fair market value is usually a result of an equation that includes the past revenues, past sales, and profits. So, you want to be able to show that you are paying the fair market value of a business. So if you're buying a business from a friend or a family member, you want to be very careful to show that you actually are paying what the business would cost if it were advertised on the open market. If you're getting a significant discount on the business, that could raise issues at the consulate, because they do want to see you're actually investing what they call a substantial amount. So as I said before, franchises are generally a good option for an E-2 visa, and franchises would usually lay out how much money is required for the franchise and how much you should be spending, as well as the franchise fee. So if you can show you've entered into a franchise agreement and here are the anticipated costs for that franchise, and that you've paid what is required, usually that is sufficient. And there are good and bad E-2 expenditures. So good expenditures, I would just say, are those expenditures that are necessary for the business to be operational. So inventory, marketing, paying for an office space, equipment, buying chairs, printers, computers. These are all good E-2 expenditures. So what are bad E-2 expenditures? Travel expenses. So if you're coming to the US to scope out business opportunities, don't include travel expenses. Educational fees. So don't include tuition you've paid to get a degree, or typically even training, unless the training is very specifically required for your business. Certain expenses are borderline. They're not clearly good. They're not clearly bad. In that category, I would put vehicles. If the business clearly requires a car or a truck, so for example, I've had clients who are starting cleaning companies or construction companies or pool maintenance companies, they need a car, they need a truck to move their crews around, to move the equipment. So no problem, we would include a vehicle there. I do have people come to me and say, I'm starting a consulting business where, we're basically going to help people improve their businesses, and I need a car for that. That's a hard sell. It's hard to convince a consular officer that you need a car for that business. So the officer's likely to not include that car as part of the investment. So we would have a discussion with the client to see if they actually want to include that. And we would probably recommend that they not include it. Just 1 second. All right. So let's get to another very common question, which is whether you have to hire employees. The answer to this is you do have to hire employees. You have to show the consular officer that your business will employ at least 3 full-time equivalent US workers within a 5-year period. That's the general benchmark that we give. You don't have to do that before you apply. You don't have to employ US workers before you apply. So if you are applying without workers, you would include a business plan in your application. And a business plan is really a key part of the application if your business is a startup and you don't have workers. So why is a business plan especially critical? Well, what it would do is lay out exactly how you're going to sell your products or services, all of the assumptions you're making, how many clients you're going to have, what you're going to charge for your products, how much you're going to sell in years 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then you're going to show based on that why you need employees to help you with that business. And that leads to the personnel projections that you include in your business plan. So the business plan is key if you have a startup. If you don't have a startup, if you're purchasing a business in the US, it is always a good idea to buy a business that already employs US workers. If you're buying a business that's been operational for, say, 10 years, and they've never had a US worker, they've only employed the business owner, that's a problem, because you're going to need to convince a consular officer that you're going to do something very different from the last owner so that you're actually going to create jobs for US workers. And that can be a hard sell if the business has never done that. So you can save yourself a lot of time and effort by just looking for a business that already has at least 3 US workers, 3 full-time equivalent US workers. And how do you prove how many workers a business has? That would be done through tax records. So if someone's an employee, they're issued a W-2 form. If they're an independent contractor, they are issued a 1099 form. W-2 workers carry more weight than independent contractors because there tends to be more stability in those jobs. W-2 employees tend to stay with an employer for longer than 1099 workers, and they tend to get benefits as well. So the government likes to see a business that has W-2 employees because these are workers who are likely to stay at the business and receive benefits through it. The number of employees, when I refer to at least 3 over the course of 5 years, that does not include the E-2 investor or their family. That's very important. So that includes people who are not related to the E-2 investor, who have work authorization in the US. So that could be US citizens, permanent residents, or people who are on a temporary visa but have work authorization. And I already talked about business plans, so I won't spend too much time on this, but do you need a business plan? If the business is already employing 3 workers, you probably don't need a business plan. A business plan is really helpful if you're trying to show that the business is going to do something it has not done in the past, namely employ at least 3 workers. So a business plan should have these pieces to it that you see on the screen: a summary, because officers will typically not read past the first page or 2. So it's good to summarize everything in an executive summary. And then everything that really bolsters the personnel projections: how you're going to market the business, how you're going to sell things, who your competitors are. You should include very thorough and detailed financial projections through a profit and loss statement, looking at the next 5 years, a balance sheet looking at the next 5 years, a cash flow statement looking at the next 5 years. So these business plans really are robust. Most of our clients do have someone prepare the business plan for them, although that's not always the case. Some clients are very savvy with accounting and can do it themselves. Do you need to hire a professional if you're savvy with accounting? Not necessarily, but we do find that more often than not, it is helpful to have a professional prepare the business plan. We do prepare business plans, and I will say one of the benefits of that is that our business plans are really tailored for a consular officer to read the business plan and understand how the business qualifies for the visa. Whereas many other third parties that create business plans, their intended audience is not necessarily a consular officer. It may be prospective investors or foundations, or any number of other consumers of the information, whereas we have the consular officer in mind. And I do think that is a big benefit when you're applying for the visa. Let's quickly talk about some E-2 visa developments and trends. I'm sorry. Excuse me. So one of the recent trends is that the government does seem to want to see that E-2 investors have spent most of the investment funds in the US. So just to take an example, let's say you are Italian, a national of Italy, and you are selling things on Amazon. If where do you buy your inventory from? Let's say you have $100,000 to invest, and you're going to put $50,000 into your inventory, into these things you're going to sell on Amazon. Our recommendation would be, if you can buy those things in the US, do that, because we have found that consulates are more reluctant to approve if you buy your inventory from outside the US, or most of your investment is outside the US. So if you buy that inventory from Italy and then sell it in your online store, the government sometimes will not like to see that. Now, that's not 100% of the time. We've had plenty of approvals where that has not been an issue, but recently we have seen it become more of an issue. So if you can avoid that by investing in the US primarily, that's worth doing. Administrative processing, this is one of the most frustrating aspects of applying for an E-2 or really any visa at this time. Administrative processing is really when a consulate decides that there is additional screening that has to happen on the application. The government doesn't really disclose what that screening is about. It could be security. It could be looking at criminal history. It could be looking at travel history. We really can't know, and the government doesn't disclose the reasons for putting an application into administrative processing. What we do know is that it usually entails the application being sent from the consulate to the United States mainland, typically Washington, D.C., for an agency to look into it in more detail. It could be the FBI, could be the CIA, Department of State. But anyway, the real takeaway is that this process is a black box. It can take anywhere from a couple days to months, possibly a year or longer. So there's a ton of uncertainty when a case is put into administrative processing. There is the option to sue the government if you're approaching a year plus in administrative processing. We do have a litigation department. We have had success suing the government where there are unreasonable delays. It's not a cheap option, but that is a way to force the government to do its job and not keep something indefinitely in administrative processing. But anyway, it's good to be aware of that administrative processing does happen. Fortunately, it happens in the minority of cases. So most cases, administrative processing does not affect at all. So fingers crossed, it will not affect your application. We've also seen since COVID more USCIS filings. So USCIS filings, basically, if you are within the United States, you can apply for E-2 status through USCIS, and that is an alternative to applying for a visa at a consulate. If you're outside the US, you must apply at a consulate. You can't apply through USCIS. If you're inside the US, let's say you're here on a visitor visa or you're here on a student visa, you have the option of either applying at a consulate and then traveling to the consulate and interviewing, getting the visa and coming back in. Or if you want to stay in the US, you can apply through USCIS. USCIS filings were fairly uncommon before COVID, and for good reason, because USCIS charges more. They also tend to be far stricter about requiring you to prove exactly where you got the money from that you're investing in the business. And that is an important E-2 requirement. You do need to show the government that the money you're investing in the business was lawfully acquired, and you need to trace where it came from. If you apply with USCIS, they do essentially an audit of the financials, proving where every single dollar came from. If you apply at a consulate, they typically have page limits. So it's usually impossible to provide the detail and the documentation that USCIS requires. And I don't want to exaggerate this, but USCIS, it really is a high bar, that source of funds requirement. So compared to consulates, which do tend to be more relaxed regarding the source of funds requirement. But since COVID, USCIS filings have become more common. And that's because during COVID, of course, many international borders were closed. So people were stuck in the US. It was far harder to get to a consulate. And there were extensive delays at consulates, a year plus in some consular posts. So more people applied through USCIS. I think we are certainly seeing consulates speed up to normal times before COVID. So this has become less of an issue. And in general, it is preferred to apply at a consulate rather than USCIS. It gives you a visa, which allows you to enter and exit the country. If you're approved through USCIS, you lose that status as soon as you leave. So you need to be willing to stay in the US for quite some time. And USCIS will grant E-2 status for up to 2 years. So again, you'll get status for 2 years, but the moment you leave, you lose that status and you need to go apply for a visa anyway. Timing at consulates, as I said, consulates have gotten much, much faster. We're seeing turnaround times of between from submitting the application to actually being at the interview and getting a decision on your application. We are seeing times as short as 3 weeks to a month, up to at certain consulates, 6 months. Whereas during COVID, you would see 6 months being the norm. Now 6 months is the exception, and that is a great change that we're happy to see. Let's touch quickly on some complex issue areas with E-2 visas. I already mentioned source of funds. The funds really can come from almost any source, as long as the source is lawful and legitimate, and as long as the business and its assets are not securing the loan, if the source is a loan. So you can receive a gift from someone, from a friend, from a family member. You can get a loan as long as the loan is not secured by your E-2 company. If you get a gift, you do need to be able to show where that person got the funds. So a gift is not going to save you from proving where the funds came from. It's just going to require that someone else prove where the funds came from. Again, USCIS is very strict about you proving where the funds came from. Consulates less so. Small investment amount, I would just say most of our clients have relatively small investment amounts. We do have a practice of helping them craft applications that are strong in other aspects in spite of a low investment amount. We have a completely separate webinar on that if you'd like to check it out. E-2 visas can be issued for 2 investors as long as each one owns 50% of the business. If there are substantive changes to the business after filing, this is a complex area. You are allowed to, what I said before, the work authorization is tied to your E-2 company. You're not allowed to work for a business outside of the E-2 company, and the E-2 company should do what the application says it is going to do. So if you apply to to start a company that does technical consulting for businesses, setting up computer systems for businesses, and then you decide to open a coffee shop, that's going to be a problem, even if you do it under the same LLC, unless in your application you say, I'm starting a technical consulting company and I plan to start a coffee company as well, which you can do. You can actually define the scope of the business quite broadly. And if there's a chance you're going to do that, engage in work that's outside the scope, that is broader in scope, make your scope broad in the application so that you're not in a position where you have to go back to the government and say, hey, I'm going to do this different area. Can I get approval from that? It might require a new application. It might require notifying USCIS if you're in the US. So save yourself that headache and make your initial application broad if you think there's a chance you'll do that work. And I already mentioned family business purchases. Just make sure that you're not getting a significant discount. Make sure that everything is by the book, that you have documentation that these were all legitimate exchanges. Even though you bought a business from your brother, you paid the funds to him, those funds are gone, you're not getting them back. It can be hard to prove that. So maybe get a law firm or an accounting firm to document everything, because the government can really scrutinize purchases from family or friends. Because the government isn't sure, it's a legitimate investment. And common reasons for denials, already touched on a few of these. A low investment amount can be a common reason for a denial if the application is not strengthened in other ways. The nature of the business. There are certain businesses that are just risky, such as investment businesses, real estate businesses. When I say that, I mean real estate for the purpose of investing returns. So if you're buying land that you hope will appreciate in value, that's going to be a problem. It's not typically a problem if your real estate company is, say, flipping homes and you have a bunch of homes and you need to employ a staff, a crew that's flipping these homes. That's very different. The problem, when I talk about nature of the business, is the nature of the business doesn't clearly require workers. So if your business engages in real estate speculation or investing in stocks, and it's not clear you need to employ US workers, and it's not clear you even need to be at the business regularly, then it's probably going to be denied. You need to show the government that the business needs you to hire workers. The filing location and venue. Certain consulates are stricter than others. Certain consulates get a lot of E-2 applications from enormous companies. So when you show up with a little company, you may be denied, not because you don't qualify, but because the consulate is just used to seeing much larger businesses. Other consulates never see E-2 visa applications, so they're just not familiar with what the requirements are, which sometimes can be good, sometimes can be bad. One of the things we work with our clients on is figuring out where the ideal place to apply is. So there is a lot of strategy that goes into that. Another common reason is concern over whether the business will create jobs for U.S. workers. So I've talked about this quite a bit. That factor can make or break an application. If you really do need to convince the officer this is a business that is very likely to employ U.S. workers. And if you can do that, you are close to an approval, unless there's some other aspect the officer is concerned about. And if you can't do that, it will very likely result in a denial. Issues with the adjudicating officer, unfortunately, these decisions come down to the person who is interviewing you at the consulate. And if they are just in a bad mood or are skeptical or have any doubt, they can deny the application. So it really is important to craft the application so that it's very clear to the officer how you qualify, and really hold their hand and guide them through what your business is, what you're going to sell, why you're sure you're going to sell these things, and why you're sure you're going to employ U.S. workers. And finally, people do come to us after they've either applied on their own or worked with other firms, and they've been denied. And we look at the application and we see they actually didn't qualify. They might not have owned 50% of the business. They might have applied on a passport. That's not an E-2 treaty country passport. So sometimes this does happen, that someone just does not qualify. And let's quickly talk about renewing. You need to renew your visa once your initial visa is expired and you need to travel. So again, if you're on a 3-month visa and you're okay staying in the US for 2 years, you don't need to renew the visa every 3 months. You can stay in the US for 2 years, and then when you need to travel, you can go back to the consulate and apply for the visa then. But when you do go to renew your visa, it is very important to show you employ US workers. Again, very key requirement. And we do recommend at least 3 full-time equivalent US workers within 5 years of starting operations. The actual roles and the actual salaries paid to those workers doesn't really matter. So as long as the salary is normal for someone in that role, even if it's an office assistant, even if it's basically an entry-level role, that is okay, as long as you're employing those workers. You do want to show updated financial data. Tax returns are key to show that you're generating revenue, how much you're paying in compensation to workers. You would include W-2s and 1099s to show either employees or independent contractors that you're engaging. If your company's not doing well, really do focus on hiring workers. So let's say you're 5 years in, you have 1 employee, try to hire another one before you apply to renew. It really can make the difference in a renewal application. And of course, you want to make sure that the company still meets the E-2 requirements, that you still have 50% at least, and that any changes to the business are documented in the application. Excuse me. So we have a few minutes left. I know some questions have rolled in. Thanks for your patience as I get to those. So let's start with this question. What if one of the partners is a US national and the other from Bangladesh? If you each own 50%, that is not, I'm sorry, if the national of Bangladesh owns at least 50%, that is not a problem. So a co-owner can be a US green card holder or a US citizen. That is okay, as long as the E-2 investor, the E-2 visa applicant, owns at least 50%. So once you hit that 50% ownership, if you're a national of Bangladesh or any other E-2 treaty country, you qualify based on the nationality requirement, and it does not matter if the other owner or owners are US citizens, green card holders, etc. So just focus on that 50% requirement. All right. As a Canadian, if we receive funds as a gift or personal loan from family or friends for business purchase, can family or friends be from the US? How to use escrow? Great question. So the answer is yes, the gift can be from family or friends who are from the US. That is fine. So let's say you're a national of Canada, your sister is a US citizen. Your sister can certainly gift you or loan you the funds to invest in the business. They just need to document exactly how they got the money, whether it's from work, whether it's from selling an apartment or a house, whatever it is. I will say, if that family member or friend is a owner of the business, so if they're a co-owner and you're going to be owning this business with them, you do want to be very careful, because what it looks like on the surface is, let's say your sister has a convenience store in the US and she's gifting you the money to invest back in the business. That looks very circular. So there is a big question about, did she actually get rid of those funds, or did she give you the funds only to have them put back into the business that she's a co-owner of? So my general recommendation would be, make your source of funds separate from the business and its owners. That is certainly going to be a better way to do this. So escrow can be used. Escrow is the one exception to actually spending the money on the business. So what do I mean by that? Let's say that you've found a business in the US and it's for sale for $100,000. You don't want to write the check for $100,000 and then have the visa denied, and you've lost that $100,000. They've run off with it and you don't have a visa. So what can you do? You can use escrow in that case, where you transfer the funds to an escrow agent who holds the funds, and you would include in the application the escrow agreement. Now, critically, the only condition in that escrow agreement for the release of funds is issuance of the visa. So if there is any other condition in that escrow agreement, that is a problem. So for example, what is okay is to have an escrow agreement that says, once this visa is issued, the $100,000 will be released, period. That's fine. If there's any other condition, so if it says, once the visa is issued, the applicant is going to then, review the business and decide if the financials make sense, that's going to be a problem. You can't have another condition. It has to only be issuance of the visa, but otherwise, escrow is fine. Is it permissible for a husband to be the primary investor and financial sponsor for an E-2 visa, allowing his wife to receive? So I think what this is asking is, what if the source of funds is the spouse? That's fine, as long as you can document the source of funds. So let's say that the husband is the one who has been working for a few years and saved up and then gifts $100,000 to the wife to invest in the business. That's perfectly fine, not a problem. You just need to document where the funds came from. I have a friend that has an existing E-2 business. Can I buy 50% and get a visa? You can. You would need to take into account the things that I've mentioned during this presentation. So for example, you need to show where the money came from. You also need to show that you are paying the fair market value for that business, or for 50% of that business. If you're getting any kind of significant discount from your friend, that's probably going to be a problem. You need to make sure it's a legitimate business purchase, so that when the consular officer looks at it, they see that you paid what is the fair market value for 50% of that business. Are there new regulations that have been enacted in relation to the E-2? And if so, what are they? I mean, the E-2, fortunately, is not really a pawn in the way other immigration provisions are in politics, because E-2, both parties tend to like E-2 visas. It brings people from outside the US into the US to create jobs for US workers, which is a bipartisan thing, something that people agree on in both parties. So not really. There really have not been any significant changes depending on the administration. But if you've heard of some changes that you're curious about, do let me know. In general, we handle applications largely the same way we have, other than the changes that I mentioned before about timing, about buying inventory in the US and things like that. Suppose that my partner and I are going to invest 50-50 in a business and we're both eligible. That would be fine. As long as you own at least 50%, that's fine. What if buying a franchise business? Do we need to show workers or business plan? Yes, no exception to the employment figures. If you're starting a franchise and you don't yet employ US workers, you should have a business plan showing how you're going to employ US workers. Full cost for fees. After this presentation, feel free to reach out to our firm. The email you'll get will have our contact information, and we can send you our engagement letter, which details the process as well as the pricing. And if you have questions, a consultation is a great way to talk about the specific circumstances of your case. If the source of an E-2 visa is a family member's gift, but the person's source of funds is a loan, will this be acceptable? That can be acceptable. They just have to document the loan. And again, the loan cannot be secured by the E-2 company. Is it better to renew my visa at the consulate or through USCIS? That entirely depends on your circumstances. In general, it's usually better to go through the consulate. Just a technicality, you can't renew a visa through USCIS. Only a consulate can renew your visa. USCIS can extend your status, but they will not renew a visa. But assuming that you're asking about either extending your status or renewing the visa at a consulate, usually a consulate is better, especially if you were approved before. It's usually a streamlined process, depending on which consulate. What's the renewal requirement after 2 years? Do I need to employ 5 workers? So I think this may have been sent in before I talked about that on that slide. So the renewal requirement is what we discussed before. You want to show hiring, you want to show financial documentation, tax returns. You do need to employ 3 US workers within 5 years. What if one person's Canadian and the wife is a Canadian permanent resident, Indian passport? Excellent question. So the answer is yes, you can get an E-2 dependent visa regardless of your nationality. So if the E-2 principal, the E-2 investor, has a passport from an E-2 treaty country, say Canada, but they're married to someone who doesn't have a passport from an E-2 country, let's say India or China, the spouse can still apply for an E-2 dependent visa. They would attend the interview, typically with the primary applicant, and they would be granted E-2 dependent status for usually the period of time that the principal is granted. And one of the great things about an E-2 dependent visa is that the moment you enter the US and you're given E-2 spouse status, you can start working without separate work authorization. So if your I-94 shows E-2S when you enter, you can start working immediately for any US employer. You don't need to just work for the E-2 company. So that is a huge benefit for E-2 spouses. Children cannot work, but they can attend school. Children as well do not need to have E-2 treaty country nationality as long as their parent does, the principal does. Do we help finding a business or franchise and then setting up a business? We do not help with franchise brokers. We do have a franchise broker contact. We do not do that in-house. So we're happy to refer you out to someone. We do help set up businesses. So we do set up LLCs, we set up corporations. So would be happy to help with that. Okay, if I have an E-2 business, can we apply for an L1A or EB1C during the E-2 visa 5-year term? You can. If you qualify for a green card, you can apply for a green card while you're in the US on an E-2 visa. There are definitely aspects to be aware of. It can be very tricky to navigate that. So I would certainly recommend scheduling a consultation. But the short answer to your question is you can apply for a green card or an L1 if you qualify while you're in the US on an E-2. So do reach out to us if you want to talk about that further. All right. Can the spouse of an E-2 visa holder receive work authorization? I think this was sent in before I answered the previous question. So yes, if once you enter on an E-2 dependent visa and you have E-2 spouse status, you can begin working in the US immediately. What if the business is 80K? Can my partner and I invest 50-50? Yes, I do recommend that the investment be split 50-50 in general if you have a partner who owns half. That is generally the best way to go about it. Sometimes there are exceptions. So if you have questions, reach out. Do children get a social security number? Typically not. Usually You only get a social security number if you have authorization to work. I'm a Canadian. Once E2 is approved, can I return and re-enter? Yes, if you get an E2 visa, that's the benefit of a visa, is that you can leave and enter as often as you want on an E2 visa. The exception, as long as the visa is valid, the exception is going to be if you apply through USCIS. So if you change your status through USCIS or you extend your status through USCIS, that's not a visa. That is an extension of status. So you do need to be very careful. The moment you leave, you abandon your status if you got it through USCIS. I was denied under marginality in London on May 5th. I was not given a reason. Sounds like we need to discuss the specific circumstances. So reach out for a consultation. We'd be happy to talk through what issues you might have. All right, it is 11:01. I really appreciate the great questions, excellent questions. Do keep an eye out for our email with future webinars listed. We do hope to see you. Reach out for a consultation if we could be helpful. Really appreciate the active audience and do hope to see you all soon. All right, have a great day in the meantime.